Hello everyone, I'm Jay and welcome to my channel. So the first book that I read in January, and therefore in 2024, was Neverwhere by Neil Gaiman. So this book was complicated for me. This one was a reread, and originally it was one of the first books that I picked up when I got back into reading while I was in college. It was also one of the first fantasy books that I picked up that was aimed at an adult audience. I remember really loving the book and thinking it was amazing, groundbreaking, never read anything like it, and to be honest, I hadn't at that point. Problem is that since then, I have read a lot more, and especially a lot more fantasy. So, unfortunately, it didn't quite hold up to expectations that I had set for it. I did still enjoy it, just nowhere near as much as I had hoped that I would. It's especially a pity because I did get the illustrated edition by Chris Riddell, and it is very pretty. There are pictures or illustrations on almost every single page. Illustrations are actually incorporated on each page around the word, which I thought was a really cool way to incorporate the illustrations within the text. And honestly, it's such a pretty book, and it has enough nostalgia that I think I'm just gonna keep it. It's just too nice to get rid of. The book itself is about a man named Richard who is dropped into a parallel London where he quickly gets embroiled in an assassination attempt on a new friend that he saves from death. Where the book fell flat for me was that I had a very difficult time staying engaged with the characters. While they were very interesting, I had trouble forming an emotional attachment to any of them, which made it difficult for me to stay engaged and interested in the things that happened to them. I kept picking up and putting down this one. It actually took me a little over a month to finish this book, which is flabbergasting for me. I just had so much trouble wanting to pick up this book again after I'd put it down and gravitating towards other books I was reading. When I was actually reading it, there wasn't an issue. It's just picking it up where I kept struggling. The story read a lot like a series of vignettes, a series of stories that were happening in sequence to our characters. And I feel like it might have been a more interesting story to me if it had been portrayed in more of a short story format. That being said, I do really enjoy short stories, so that bias might be coming in a little bit here. The illustrated edition also had a copy of How the Marquis Got His Coat Back, which is a short story that is in the Neverwhere world, and that just reinforced for me that I really liked this world as a series of vignettes as opposed to one full novel. Overall, I did enjoy the book. It just wasn't quite what I had hoped it would be, but I gave it a high 3 stars, and honestly, I know that Neil Gaiman is planning on writing another novel in this world, and I would be willing to pick it up as well. So at the end of the day, it's not a lose. It's not a win, but it's not a lose. So the second book that I read this month was Pucking Around by Emily Rath. Oh boy, where to start on this one? It was not a good book. I kind of read it as a joke because I thought it would be funny, and I wasn't wrong. It definitely made me laugh a lot, so that's good. Back to the beginning though, honestly, I have a confession to make. This would have been the first book that I finished in 2024, but I purposely held off on finishing it because I just refused to let it be my first book of 2024. But anyway. This book is about a woman who starts work as a doctor for an NHL team, and she quickly becomes involved with multiple employees that work for this sports team. I really can't be mad at this book because it is exactly what it said it was going to be, so I really can't hold that against it. My main gripe is actually not with the book itself, but how it's categorized. It's marked as a romance, however, I think that does it a disservice because the romance writing is not good. I do think that it should be categorized as an erotic novel. You really don't see that genre around anymore, or books really categorized at that genre. But as an erotic novel, I actually think this book isn't terrible. I mean, I still don't think it's good, but it's not terrible. My reasoning for the erotic genre, however, is because a lot of this book is tell, not show. It doesn't really focus that much on building the relationships between these people. Instead, it goes from, I don't know these people at all, to I'm screwing all of them and we have a really deep emotional bond that came out of nowhere. And I wish there had been more of a slow burn leading up to the actual sex scenes so that we got more of an understanding of why this was important to the characters and so that they hit harder when they actually happened. I also chose to read this book as an audiobook, which was a good choice because it was 24 hours long, which is too damn long. But I was able to listen to it on some long road trips that I took, and that worked out really well because I was able to stay engaged the entire road trip, and it also made me laugh a lot during the road trip, so that was fun, although the cringing maybe was a little dangerous on the road. At the end of the day, I did end up DNFing this book, though, because 24 hours is too long. I ended up 91% of the way through this book before I just couldn't do it anymore because I still had 2.5 hours and I just was not going to put myself through that. All of the major problems had pretty much resolved themselves at this point, and I had no idea what she was going to finish off the book with. I also didn't care, so bit of a deterrent there. I really can't recommend or not recommend this book. For romance novels, I don't feel comfortable giving recommendations because it's so heavily dependent on what tropes and plots that you're interested in. I personally gave this one 2 stars. It was very, very readable, but I'm not sure I can say that I enjoyed every moment of reading this. The next book that I read this month was Second First Impressions by Sally Thorne, and part of the reason why I ended up DNFing Pucking Around. This book is about a reclusive heroine who works at a retirement village, learning to open up and expand her horizon when an unexpected visitor shows up and starts to woo her. This one was super cute. It was a very light read and had very low stakes, so it was very relaxing to read and you didn't get too bogged down by all the angst. The strength of this one was really in the characters. That being said, like a true rom-com, side characters were pretty flat. It's really just about the hero and heroine of this one, who did actually show quite a bit of growth throughout the book. Also, like a true rom-com, outside of the main character interactions, the rest of the book was pretty cheesy. Plot was cheesy, other characters cheesy, but you can overlook it for the most part because interactions are so fun. I really liked how the focus of the relationship between the characters was shown via small words and actions. The attraction wasn't conveyed only via, oh my god, they're so hot, oh my god, I can't handle how hot they are, which I've noticed in a lot of other romance novels. Instead, it was portrayed in kind of smaller gestures and actions between the characters, which I thought was really cool, kind of left up to the reader to notice. Additionally, in keeping with kind of the sweet vibe, it was not terribly steamy. In fact, I thought it was quite tame. It wasn't quite fade to black, but it was not graphic at all, which I thought suited the book, as graphic smut might have detracted from the rest of the book and just not fit in with the rest of the feelings the book imparts in you. While the book did give me a lot of happy butterflies while I was reading it, eventually towards the latter half, the angst got frustrating after a while, mainly because there was so much miscommunication between the two main characters that it became frustrating that I didn't understand why suddenly they were having so many issues or why they were beating the same issues over and over again. Because of this book ended up being 4 stars for me, which is still good, but it just missed that 5-star because of all of the latter half of the book's miscommunications and issues. Still quite a solid book, though, and I did enjoy reading it. After that, I picked up Fugitive Telemetry by Martha Wells, the 6th book in the Murderbot series. The Murderbot series is about a sentient robot that hacks its programming to achieve free will and all the shenanigans that ensue as it starts to make its own decisions. All of these books are very episodic, so you don't necessarily have to read them all in order, with the exception of the novels. However, obviously, it does make more sense from a continuity point of view if you read them all in order, so I do recommend it. That being said, one thing that is kind of weird, and this is more of a series critique as opposed to an individual novel or novella critique, is that the 5th book and the 7th book kind of skip over the 6th novella, so that the 6th novella kind of feels out of time in that regard. So it seems like maybe Martha Wells was trying to do continuous novellas, and then the books are kind of outside of the novella timeline, but it is kind of disconcerting when you're reading them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, because the timeline jumps is weird and it kind of takes stakes out of the overall plot line between the 5th and 7th. That being said, I haven't read the 7th yet, so, maybe I'm talking out my ass. We'll find out. Back to the actual 6th novella, though. It was good. It was very fun. For some reason with Murderbot, I always have a little bit trouble staying super engaged in the beginning when the premise is building. And this one was no different. Same thing. Took me a while to get into it, but once I was in it, I was in it. It really helped that I know that I like Murderbot, so there really wasn't going to be an issue of me not completing it. And once the action started, true to form, I was in it, very much enjoying it, excited to see what was going to happen next. Overall, as the 6th novella in a series of novellas, there's not too much to say. These books really aren't that long. They're really good time, but they're not too complicated. They don't bring up a ton of really complex philosophical questions. It's mostly just a fun read. On that note, I gave this one 4 stars, so solid read. Enjoyed it. Fun. Not really much else more to say. The next book of the month was Irresistibly Yours by Lauren Layne, the first book in the Oxford series. In this book, the 2 main characters are competing for the same job. They then have to balance this with their growing friendship and attraction as the book continues. This is another book that I read this month that was very reminiscent of a rom-com, this one specifically from the early 2000s. But if those rom-coms got really graphic. It honestly was one of the closest books I've read to a true rom-com where I could see it almost adapted to the screen within my head. It's very much a story of heroine who doesn't realize her own worth, slowly discovers it, and realizes how great she is before the book ends. I thought that the characters came across as very mature. They communicated very well throughout the entire book, and there wasn't any weird drama that ensued from random places that didn't make any sense in the continuity of the story. They handled the 3rd act breakup very well. There was just one thing that kind of seemed a little off, but overall I was able to overlook it based on how they were able to communicate before and after. I also like that they started off as friends first, so their attraction really had the chance to grow, and it really made sense each stage of their relationship as they hit it. That being said, it did fall into the pitfall of a little too much self-deprecation, I thought, from the heroine. It's very common in stories where the heroine starts with not understanding her own worth, and this one definitely fit that mold as well. I wish that she had a little bit of a more steady progress and didn't fall back as much, and it seemed like sometimes 1 step forward, 2 steps back. It was a fun book, though. It didn't end up giving me any butterflies, so I ended up giving it a high 3 because it was fun and I don't regret reading it, but I'm not going to remember this book in a year. Next up was On a Wicked Dawn by Stephanie Lauren, the 9th book in the Sinister series. I DNF'd this book at 22% after 2 days, so I don't have much to say about this one. Heroine decides that she wants to marry her childhood friend and is going to convince him to do that. He immediately agrees, and therein lies the problem I had with this book. There's very little tension in this book. She wants to marry him, he immediately agrees. I'm not really sure what the rest of the book is about. There's kind of some excuse of a plot of they don't want each other to know that they love each other, but it just feels very pointless because they're already agreed to marry each other. Right before I put it down, the book tried to introduce a plot point of an evil brother, but it was too little too late. I did not care. I was not going to keep reading. I was really sad about this one, though, because I love Friends to Lovers and just did not deliver. For the most part, I try not to rate my DNFs. There are exceptions if I put a book down because I just really, 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 really hated it, or if I get farther than 40 to 50% into the book, I'll give it a rating. But since this one was only 22%, I will not be rating this one. It wasn't for me. The next book I picked up was I Think I Love You by Lauren Layne, the 5th book in the Oxford series. In this one, the hero wants to learn how to be attractive and seduce men and goes to her best friend, who also just so happens to be a man, to learn how to do it. Starting in around late last year, I became a huge proponent of picking up romance novels in a series in any order you want because some of them are going to appeal to you and some of them are not, especially considering that romance is so dependent on what tropes you like. Some of the books in the series are probably not going to hit your fancy. and yet I still DNF'd this one. I think my mistake with this one was that I tried to pick it up too soon after Irresistibly Yours. I think it was only a couple days in between them. And honestly, they're just a little too similar. The characters are pretty much the same characters with slightly different quirks, which is fine, and I don't mind that, but not back to back. I ended up getting bored because I was not interested in reading about the same characters doing the same things again. Even though they're not doing the same things plot-wise, it just had the same vibe, it had the same feeling, and I just didn't want that back to back. I didn't know this about myself, so I kind of should have seen this coming. This is my fault. I ended up getting about 19% of the way through the book, so again, I'm not going to be rating this. A book that I picked up before the 2 DNFs though, but I didn't finish until much later, was Age of Legend by Michael J. Sullivan. And this is the 4th book in the Legends of the First Empire series. This series is meant to tell the story of how civilization started in the world that Michael J. Sullivan has created. It's kind of like not quite a prequel to the Ryaria Revelation series that he is most known for. But I believe that he did say the point of the series was to kind of examine how myths and legends change over time, and the legends that are in the Ryaria Revelations actually started and actually originated. Since this is the 4th one in the series, there's not really much I can talk about plot-wise, but I do think that the series is getting better and better as time goes on. I think the first book for me was a 3-star, and then each one has been getting slightly higher until finally this book was a 4-star. I really like how the characters are developing, how they're coming into their own. There was one point in the book where one of the characters' actions made absolutely no sense to me, especially from a character development standpoint. So that was frustrating. However, I think it had to happen because of plot reasons. So I understand why Sullivan decided to do this, but it felt bad. I didn't like it. It did drop the rating for me for a little bit, but afterwards I was able to look past it and it bounced back up. That being said, there's actually very little plot-wise that happens in this book. It definitely reads as a setup book, like their own trilogy in a way, and the next 3 books are the second half. I think the reason for that is because the first 3 books in the series are or the second trilogy that follows it, I think probably similar to the Mistborn saga, except there's a little bit more continuity than there is between the Mistborn trilogies. Well, I guess technically the second one isn't a trilogy. Anyway, moving on, there's about a 5-year gap between the first half of the series, the first 3 books, and the second half of the 3 books. So this book is definitely a setup for the rest of it, but you can tell that from where the setup is going, it's going to go into some really interesting places. So I'm very excited about reading the next 2 books as well. I do want to warn, though, that if you do pick up the series and you get to the 4th book, it ends on a pretty massive cliffhanger. So if you don't mind it, it's not a huge issue. But if you hate cliffhangers, make sure you have the 5th book ready, because otherwise you're going to be very frustrated. After that, I picked up Naked in Death by J.D. Robb, the first book in the In Death series. This book did not age well. The cool thing about this book is that it takes place in the future. So it has a very futuristic setting, urban future, think Blade Runner, that kind of thing. But honestly, the setting was the only reason I read as far as I did, which was not far. I got in 13% of the way through the book. It's about a female detective who is investigating the murder of a senator's granddaughter who works as a prostitute. It definitely fits a lot of the stereotypes of not the Mary Sue character, but like a female version of kind of the Robert Langdon character from the Dan Brown books, where the main character is super competent, super hot. Everybody who meets her wants something from her. If it's a man, it's sex. If it's a woman, then to be her. And it's just a lot to read about. It seemed to be pro-sex work and saying that sex work could exist in our society, maybe just with more regulation to protect the sex work and to protect the clients. But then at the same time, it called the murder victim a whore. It seemed to degrade her and be derogatory towards her about her choice in career. I just could not get this one pegged what it was trying to say. So I decided to just give up and not bother finishing. The next book I finished was 7 Dirty Secrets by Natalie D. Richards, which I managed to finish in one day. In this one, a girl is sent on a sadistic scavenger hunt that all seems to tie back to the night 1 year ago where her boyfriend turned up dead after a whitewater rafting trip gone wrong. This one was surprisingly addictive. There wasn't anything I think that was standout amazing about it, but it was very fun to listen to. I was able to figure out who the big bad was fairly easily. It wasn't really a big shock or anything. The twists didn't really land, but they were still kind of satisfying when they came, even though they were expected. On top of that, the premise was a little bonkers, but honestly, what thriller doesn't have a bonkers premise? So I can kind of give it a pass because it was at least enjoyable to sit through. One thing to be aware of before going into this book, though, is that it does deal with domestic abuse, and all the characters in the book handle it really poorly, I think. It's very much glossed over and not really taken seriously, in my opinion, by the characters, or at least not taken seriously enough. Another thing, and this is very much a me problem, this is not a book problem, was that I'm still kind of getting used to audiobooks. I only really started listening to them towards the latter half of December 2023, so they're still very new to me, and I'm getting used to having one narrator do different voices for different characters. I've had different experiences with different books, and sometimes the voices the narrator puts on don't put me off at all, and sometimes they do. They really take me out. And this one was a case where the narration took me out a little bit. I don't necessarily think it was a bad job. It's just something about the voices didn't resonate with me. But like I said, that's very much a me problem, not a book problem. At the end of the day, I did enjoy this more than I had any issues with it. It wasn't anything complex. I really have no expectations to remember this book at all, but it was fun while it lasted, and I'm glad that I read it. So it's a high 3 stars for me. Then, after another week before I finished my next book, I wrapped up In Cold Blood by Truman Capote. This book, or so I've heard, is supposed to have triggered the true crime genre or the historical retelling drama, and I can definitely see how it did that. It covers the murder of the Clutter family in 1959 and tells the story of both the investigation and fallout from the crime. This book is beautifully written. Capote uses some stunning turns of phrases to impart not just the imagery, but also the feeling of the setting. It could definitely be argued to borderline on pretentious, but I'm a little biased because I kind of like pretentious writing, like The Secret History or When We Were Villains. I eat that shit up. I do think that Capote did an excellent job humanizing everyone involved, from the victims to the investigators to the assailants to just random bystander townspeople. Everyone felt human and felt very real and like they actually lived, because they did. My only complaint is that there are portions in the middle and the end of the book that are very slow. Capote really liked to go off on tangents, and sometimes they did add to the story, but sometimes they were a detriment, in my opinion. There were portions that would have nothing to do with the crime or the story of the crime whatsoever, and it would go on for pages and pages. Like, there were letters from some of the assailants' family and friends that were just hundreds of words long, and they were just not necessary to the story. They didn't add anything at all. So I wish they had just not been included, because honestly, they detract from the overall experience. Another thing to be aware of is that this book was written in 1965, so it does use quite dated language, and there's a lot of just casual racism thrown in there, not in a graphic hate crime way, but more in a subdued, nefarious, culturally entrenched way. So if that's something that bothers you, you might want to avoid this one. I gave this one 4 stars. I thought it was really valuable as an insight into why it was so pivotal to true crime as a genre and how it kick-started that entire genre. And I'm really glad I read it. It was also beautifully written, so it wasn't that painful to read it either, which is nice and can't always be said for some historical novels. After that, I wrapped up listening to The Henna Artist by Alka Joshi, the first book in the Jaipur trilogy. This book is about Lakshmi, a henna artist in Jaipur, whose life is thrown into chaos when an unknown 12-year-old sister she never knew she had arrives at her house to live with her. This book is a really weird one for me to review, because it's not bad, but I don't think it's good either. Overall, I think the book never figured out what it wanted to say. The main character felt very directionless by the end, and I don't know if that was the intention, but it didn't feel satisfying at all. And not in a intentional way, but more in a the author didn't know what they were trying to say way. The book grapples with a lot of topics like abortion and women's rights and women's place in the world, but oftentimes didn't seem to have an actual opinion on any of these topics. Lakshmi definitely waffled between being very set in her deals and having to question them throughout the book, which is fairly standard for a literary fiction book, but by the end, I couldn't tell what her stance was. I couldn't tell if she still agreed with her initial emotions, her initial ideals, or if she'd swapped them by the end of the book. And because of that, I wasn't sure what to think. She would go from being pro-prostitution, pro-abortion to seem almost anti-prostitution, anti-abortion, and then back to pro, and then back to anti, and there was no real outcome. By the end of the book, I feel like the book had said nothing. Just, here are some issues. They exist as ideological dilemmas. And overall, I just didn't get anything out of this book. Because of that, I ended up giving it a 2-star review. So I don't think I'm going to be picking up anything else in this series. It's just not for me. The next book I picked up is A Conspiracy in Belgravia by Sherry Thomas, book 2 in the Lady Sherlock series. This book is a historical mystery that takes the idea of if Sherlock Holmes was a woman, how would the stories have gone? The Lady Sherlock books are very middle of the road. I really don't have anything to say here. I like them, but there's nothing really standout about them, I think. Like most mystery novels, they start pretty slow until the mystery kind of unfolds before you. Sometimes they pick up a little towards the end, but it really will depend on what the mystery is. I'm usually pretty bad at figuring out mysteries as I'm reading them, and this one was no exception. I did not figure it out by the end, but I like that about mystery novels. I like being able to shut my brain off and not predict what's going to happen. A lot of the times, if I am able to predict what's going to happen, then I'm not as impressed by the mystery novel. It's a fine balance. You know, you have to be able to connect the dots once it's revealed without having figured it out yourself beforehand, or at least that's what I think makes a good mystery novel. And for the most part, Sherry Thomas is able to do that for me, so I do like her books. I actually found Sherry Thomas by picking up her historical romance first, and I have loved every single one that I've picked up so far, which is what brought me to this series anyway. Overall, I think that it is definitely more of a slow burn in the character development sphere, which I'm okay with. I love that. But like I said, this is very much a book that just caters to my interests, and overall, from an objective standpoint, which maybe I shouldn't say that because there's no such thing when everything is opinions, but from a quote-unquote objective standpoint, I think it's a very middle-of-the-road book and quite solid. Gave it a high 3 stars, and I'm definitely excited to pick up the third one in the series. I then decided to DNF The Eight by Katherine Neville, the first book in the Eight duology. This book I had on my shelves since I was in middle school, I think like 15 years ago or something like that. Just an absolutely bonkers amount of time. It is very much a Dan Brown Da Vinci Code style book where there is this magical chessboard MacGuffin that everyone's trying to track down, and the book kind of balances between a historical timeline and a modern timeline. Well, modern to like the 80s. So 80s timeline where they're trying to track down all the pieces to, I don't know, gain super cool power or something like that. It's very convoluted. It's a MacGuffin. With this one, I had a really hard time staying engaged. I don't necessarily think it was an issue with the book itself so much as I have just outgrown this style of storytelling and it just doesn't really appeal to me anymore. I actually had a bit of a hard time putting this one down because technically it didn't do anything wrong. It just wasn't appealing to me. And I finally decided not to pick it back up because when it came time to actually read it, pick it back up, I realized I really didn't want to. So instead of forcing myself through another 50 pages, I just gave in and decided, you know what, I'd rather read something that I'm excited to read. I did manage to get around 20% into the book before I decided to DNF it, and at that point there still hadn't really been anything but exposition. There had been very little action. The historical portions really had no action. They were purely just info dumps, and having the action chapters interspersed by chapters of essentially nothing happening, no plot progression. By the time you get back to the action, there's no engagement anymore. You've lost all sense of urgency. All in all, if you like Dan Brown style books, then definitely pick it up, but otherwise, it might not be for you. Next book I finished was I hesitate to even call it a novella. It was so short. So a short story called Lost and Found by Stephanie Lawrence. It was Sinister 9.5. This one is about Reggie, who meets up with family friend daughter Anne, who he's known his entire life, and he realizes that he loves her. Together they then try to reunite an illegitimate son with his family who didn't know he existed. I mean, this one is a short story romance novella, so honestly, there's only 2 types of romance stories that really work in this context, and that's either insta-love or we've been in love with each other for ages and we're just finally like consummating it. This one went with the insta-love route, so that there's really not much to say here. It's a very basic story. Everything goes well. It's all happy. Everything goes very fast. It's a romance short story. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of insta-love. I don't really buy it most of the time, and this was no exception. I prefer it when they've always been in love with each other. So, not bad, not good. Gave it a low 3 stars. The book that I listened to next was The Dry by Jane Harper, the first book in the Aaron Fox series. This is a crime mystery novel where the detective returns to the small town he grew up in and has a lot of bad memories in when his childhood friend has allegedly murdered his entire family and himself. He then goes on to investigate said crime. This one is very much a almost classic detective mystery rather than a thriller. I like that it didn't really get too sensational. It kept it more grounded for me and it felt more realistic than when there's some maniacal murderer who's coming out of the woodwork to like connive everything, and it just gets weird. It handled the setting very well with the kind of close-minded small town vibes. There were a lot of small injustices that felt very at home in the small town setting, and I thought the book did a really good job of portraying that to the point where it actually frustrated me a little bit, and I almost didn't like it, but it was done so well I couldn't be too mad about it. This book did end up doing the cop-out where the murderer admits their guilt at the end and like why they did it, which, it's a bit of a cop-out, like I said. But I think in a story context, it's not that much of a sin. After finishing this one, I did have to sit with my thoughts for a while and kind of collect them to determine what my opinion of the book was. And I think that is a good thing. I think it's important for books to make you think, and this one definitely did. So overall, I ended up giving it a 4 stars. I did really enjoy this one. After finishing The Dry, I realized I wasn't reading any fantasy for at least a week up till that point, and I was going through withdrawal. I was really craving some. So I decided to pick up a short novella called Flowers for the Sea by Zin E. Rocklyn. This book was pretty short, so I figured it wouldn't take too much to finish. I think it was only 104 pages, so I figured it wouldn't be too much of an add-on to the books that I was currently reading, and just decided to pick it up and finish it really quickly. In this one, the earth has flooded, and this woman is living on an ark and pregnant with a baby that she doesn't want. The story kind of follows the last point of her pregnancy and giving birth. After checking the Goodreads, I realized this book was very polarizing. People either really seem to love it or really seem to hate it, and unfortunately I'm in the latter camp. I thought this book was really weird, but not in a good way. I thought it was too short for what the author was trying to do with it. She tried to tackle a lot of themes, including grief, postpartum depression, generational trauma, racism, colorism, pregnancy. There was a lot going on in this 104-page novella. And in my opinion, I didn't think any of them were really tackled successfully. The prose was extremely flowery and extremely vague. You really have no idea what's going on, and even by the end, textually, you still have no idea what's going on. Anything you get from the story is fully extrapolated, and honestly, in my opinion, can be taken in many different directions. I'm not sure if that was intentional, but what came out of it was when you can extrapolate anything you want from the story, I personally feel like the story's not saying anything. Instead, it's just an open vessel that the reader can then impart whatever meaning they want onto it. I also think that the main character ended up being more of an unreliable narrator. She would tell us certain things, and then immediately after, actions seemed to completely disagree with what she had told us before. I kept reading because it was so short, and I kept hoping that either something would be revealed through the storytelling or through plot progression that would make sense of the book, but unfortunately, it just never happened. I ended up giving this one a 2. I waffled between giving it a 1 or a 2 stars, but I ended up with a 2 because as many issues I had with this book, it didn't cause rage in me, which is really part of the criteria for when I give a 1 star. So it is probably a low 2 star, but it's a 2. I then finished The Devotion of Suspect X by Keigo Higashino and translated by Alexander O. Smith and Eli J. Alexander. This one was really fun, and I just flew through it. The crux of the story is essentially a cat and mouse game between the assailants in a murder and the authorities who are trying to solve it. What makes this particular mystery so intriguing is that the murder happens on page at the beginning of the book, so you know exactly who did it, why they did it, and what happened to lead up to it. Instead, the tension comes from the push and pull of the assailants trying to stay ahead of the authorities. I love the format, and I've never seen anything like this before in the mysteries that I have read. So it was very, very engaging for me, like watching a battle of wits between the two sides. There were some things that frustrated me, especially about the premise behind the murder, that might have just been to cultural differences, since this is originally a Japanese novel that was published in Japan in Japanese. So a lot of the things that did frustrate me, I've kind of brushed off as cultural differences, whether that's right or wrong. I definitely did not see the plot twist even coming, let alone what the plot twist ended up being. So that was a very exciting moment while I was reading this one. For me, mystery novels, more often than not, really, really hit home when there is something unique about them. Something interesting and different about either the way that the mystery is told or some aspect of the mechanics of the mystery itself. Agatha Christie is a good example of an author who likes to do this, and I thought this book also fell into that camp as well. Because of all that, I actually ended up giving this book 5 stars! Yay! First one of 2024. And a big part of my enjoyment, I do want to stress, is thanks to the translators, Alexander O. Smith and Eli J. Alexander. I do think that translators don't often get a lot of notice for their work, but I do want to give them props because though the story and the words are Keigo Higashino's, they did an excellent job of translating it into English and made it very enjoyable to read. So I appreciate them for that. I also finished One Was Lost by Natalie D. Richards. This is a YA thriller about high schoolers who go hiking with a school group before getting drugged and sabotaged. They have to figure out who's tormenting them and how to escape from the remote wilderness before they're killed. My reading experience for this one was a lot like my experience with Seven Dirty Secrets. They were both really, really fun to read, kind of like popcorn, with absolutely no lasting value to me as a person. I'm starting to learn that I actually seem to really like YA thrillers as that kind of read. They tend to not be focused on domestic topics, which I'm not a fan of, adult domestic thrillers. And they tend to be really enjoyable flash moments that don't require a lot of thought, and I can easily pick up, finish off, and move on to the next thing. As is typical for a number of YA books, the theming in this was very heavy-handed, filled with themes like staying true to yourself, believing in yourself, coming into your own. All very important themes, but all very, very in your face. It was impossible to miss them in this book. While all these themes are very valuable, I'm not really at a point in my life where they mean as much to me. I've kind of reached that point. So while the themes were nice, they were almost a little too heavy-handed for me. I would have liked it if they were a little bit more subtle. Additionally, I thought the romance was a little too prevalent here. These kids are essentially fighting for their lives in the wilderness. I feel like maybe they're thinking about making out a little bit too much for that context, but I don't know. I haven't been a teenager for a while, so, maybe that is the important thing when there's a murderer on the loose. Who knows? Either way, it was very fun. I gave it a low 3 stars, and I think I will be picking up more YA thrillers in the future. The final book I picked up for this month was Flowerheart by Katherine Bakewell. This one is about a girl who can't control her magic and needs help from the hero to cure a curse she accidentally cast on her father. I really wanted to like this one, but in the end, I was just dreading it so much and I didn't want to pick it up. So at some point, I just made the executive decision to stop picking it up. The main character in this one had a lot of self-esteem issues. Her unruly magic was a very obvious metaphor for not having confidence in herself and always talking down to herself, to the point where I didn't care about the character either. It was just a little too prevalent in the narrative, and the reader never really got a break. It was just constantly her self-derision overtaking the narrative and the other aspects of the story. On top of that, the hero just didn't really appeal to me. He makes some choices at the beginning of the story that just seem absolutely irredeemable to me. I know that eventually he's going to change his ways or whatever, because that's how romance novels go, but I don't see how the story could progress in any way that would justify the choices that he makes in the beginning of the story. On top of that, I felt like I could just see exactly where the story was going, so there was no reason for me to want to continue. And that's everything that I read this month. I read around 14 books, which is a lot for me, and DNF'd 5 books. The average rating was 3.4, which is pretty standard for me. Not a terribly unusual reading month in that regard. Books that I started this month but have yet to finish include The Bone Clocks by David Mitchell, The City of Dreaming Books by Walter Moers. Sorry, I do not speak German. And translated by John Brown John. Eversion by Alastair Reynolds. And finally, Godkiller by Hannah Kaner. And that's everything reading related that I have for January. The only other thing I have to talk about is crafting updates, because I have way too many hobbies and no outlet to talk about them. This will be super brief, but here are some of the projects that I completed this month. These two are shirts that I sewed, and they were for my partner's birthday, which just passed. I also picked up cross-stitch in the last couple months, and here is my current progress in my current project. I originally started this in December, which is why it's Christmas themed, but naively had no idea how long it would take me. It was going to take me a lot more than just a couple weeks in December, so I'm still working on it. The pattern is Christmas Town by Stitchovia, and I've included a link to her Etsy shop in the description. I also like to knit, but I don't really have anything to show for it at the moment because I find that I'm either cross-stitching or knitting, so right now it's just cross-stitch. If anything comes up with knitting, I'll let you guys know. That's everything for me this month, so thank you so much for watching, and I hope that I'll see you next month. Until then.